I'm starting a series that looks at the music of the spheres. Really, it's any available literature, and today I'll be looking at The Music of the Spheres, Musical Theory and Alchemical Image by Margaret Mendenhall. From De Harmonia Musicorum Instrumentorum Opus, Francio Gaffurio, 1518. Depicting the musical universe as the tones and modes of the musical scale that coordinate with the heavenly bodies, the music of the spheres, as seen above, was originally a woodcut which served as a frontispiece of the treatise Practica Musicis, written by Francino Gaffurio, 1518. Gaffurio, also known as Gaffurius, was the choirmaster of the Cathedral of Milan. His treatise was based on the Hermetic tradition of Pythagoreanism, and the image he constructed to illustrate his thesis has intrigued alchemists for centuries. This paper will explore both the Pythagorean musical theory that the image was originally created to illuminate, as well as the alchemical symbolism that has fascinated scholars for the last 500 years. 1. The musical theory represented. To understand Pythagorean musical theory, we must of course begin with Pythagoras. While there is no direct surviving written documentation attributed to Pythagoras, we do have second-hand accounts of his teachings from his followers and commentaries from later philosophers. Also, although modern scholars are now divided on how much of his work can be attributed to a historical figure born in the 6th century BC on the island of Samos, all ancient biographers do agree that Pythagoras studied geometry in Egypt and was the first outsider to be initiated into the mysteries of the Egyptian religion. He also received instruction in astronomy from the Chaldeans, acknowledged to be the masters of that science. Pythagoras was the first to call himself a philosophos, meaning a lover of wisdom. His predecessors merely called themselves sophoi, the wise. Of the many distinctions given to Pythagoras as a primary thinker in philosophy, mathematics, music, and cosmology, perhaps the most significant one is that he did not like to make them. Instead, he taught of the interrelatedness of all human knowledge. Footnote 1. Although this image was first published in Gaffurio's earlier treatise Practica Musicis, the illustration reproduced here also appeared in his later work, De Harmonia Musicorum Instrumentorum Opus. Pythagorean philosophy was based on dualism, specifically 10 dualities, the first and most important one being the relationship between the limited and the unlimited. Pythagoras was the first to express this concept in numbers, and one of his most important numerical symbols was the tetractys of the decad, an arrangement of points in the shape of a triangle. To visualize this figure, imagine the placement of pool balls within the triangle just before the break. Regarding music, Pythagoras believed that it could be divided into 3 basic types: musica instrumentalis, the music made by playing instruments; musica humana, the unheard continuous music made by each human organism, especially the resonance between the soul and the body; and musica mundana, music made by the cosmos, which would come to be known as the music of the spheres. Aside from these classifications, Pythagoras' broadest contribution to musical theory was his discovery of the relationship between mathematical ratios and harmonic intervals. The story of how Pythagoras came about this breakthrough is legend. Paraphrasing the tale from a retelling by Iamblichus, a biographer of Pythagoras and a student of Porphyry, it goes as follows. One day Pythagoras was out walking, thinking about whether it would be possible to create a way to balance and measure the differences between musical notes. As he was considering this, he happened to pass a blacksmith's shop and heard hammers beating out harmonizing sounds. He went in and asked the smithy how was it possible that the hammers were all making different sounds. The smithy then showed Pythagoras that the different hammers were of different weights. A 12-pound hammer was twice as heavy as a 6-pound one and had a ratio of 2:1, which Pythagoras recognized as sounding at the interval of an octave. An 8-pound hammer and a 12-pound one had the ratio of 2:3, which Pythagoras heard as a major fifth, while a 9-pound hammer and a 12-pound tool had the ratio of 3:4, which produced a major fourth. Pythagoras, as legend has it, went home to experiment. He He tested his theory on another of his inventions, the monochord. The monochord was made up of one stretched-out gut string and a movable bridge that enables one to shorten the length of the string plucked. This same device was used from Pythagoras' time up until that of Gaffurio to test harmonic laws. Also important to the symbolism of Gaffurio's image, Pythagoras conceived the relationships between the distances between celestial bodies in his Music of the Spheres. Counting outward from the earth to the outermost sphere of the fixed stars, Pythagoras fixed the musical intervals as follows. From earth to the moon was a whole step, from the moon to Mercury a half step, Mercury to Venus another half step, from Venus to the sun was a minor third, which was equal to 3 half steps, the sun to Mars a whole step, Mars to Jupiter a half step, Jupiter to Saturn a half step, and from Saturn to the sphere of the fixed star another minor third. Pythagoras' followers codified his wisdom in the golden verses of Pythagoras, which were considered sacred and not meant to be exposed to the profane gaze of the uninitiated. Pythagoras' concepts were also adopted by Plato in his Timaeus, where he used them in his own model for the creation of the soul of the universe. The Pythagorean mystery cult survived the centuries, with one of the most important prophets of Pythagorean-like ideas being Hermes Trismegistus himself. In Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes adopted the idea of cosmic harmony in order to use its magic powers to divert cosmic energy for use on Earth. Sometime around 1460, Cosimo de' Medici obtained an almost complete manuscript of Corpus Hermeticum. Medici gave the Greek text to Marsilio Ficino to translate, and it became a sensation among the Florentine literati. Ficino, an ardent believer in sympathetic magic in his own right, adopted Plato's concept of the world having a single, indivisible soul from Timaeus, and used music to explain the cosmic spirit, or spiritus mundi, that was constantly flowing in and around the sublunary world. Returning to the ancient Greeks, 2 things should be noted about their classical music theory. As alchemically fascinating as Pythagoras' ideas are, there were 3 competing schools of thought on the subject of musical intervals. There was the Pythagorean concept of the relationship between music ratios and the cosmos, the tradition of harmonicists, which, as the name indicates, had to do with the science of harmonics, and the Aristoxenean school, which was based on Aristotelian principles. Secondly, much of Greek musical theory was theoretical as opposed to practical, that is, having to do with the tuning of actual musical instruments in order to play them. Eventually, these classical Greek music concepts became the foundation for the theories of canonics in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, canonics being the study of pitches, intervals, and their ratios. During the period from AD 1000 to 1500, there were roughly 150 different treatises written on the subject. Gaffurio's Practica Musicis, written in 1492, was one of them. Gaffurio, in his Practica Musicis, disagreed with a competing treatise, Musica Practica, written by the Spanish musical theorist Bartolomeo Ramis da Perea. Gaffurio used the music of the spheres to demonstrate the superiority of his theory based on traditional Pythagorean ratios, which favor pure octaves, fifths, and fourths over Rami's concept of just tuning by pure thirds. As the woodcut so beautifully illustrates, Gaffurio held fast to his belief in the theory of Pythagorean tuning in relation to the structure of the cosmos, even though he admitted that in practice it was Rami's tuning that was actually used to tune the organs of the time. Although the idea of ratios to interpret intervals became a foundation for Western musical theory, the actual formulas were improved upon using something that was not available to Pythagoras, irrational numbers. Currently, the use of contemporary mathematics has also reunited musical theory and actual musical practice. 2. Alchemical Symbolism. While the Pythagorean ratios incorporated into the music of the spheres may have been improved upon over the centuries, the alchemical symbolism of the woodcut is still intriguing. Apart from the representations of the musical interludes, the image is rife with the figures of other relationships and numeric formulas. The descending serpent bisecting the image cuts through the spheres of the four elements at the bottom of the illustration and then divides into three animal heads. The lion in the center, the wolf on the left, and the dog on the right. In creative mythology, Joseph Campbell indicates that Gaffurio identified the serpent with the three-headed guard dog of Hades, Cerberus. The heads of the beast represent devouring time in its three aspects: present, past, and future. In pagan mysteries in the Renaissance, Edgar Wind, in addition to the identification Gaffurio made with Cerberus, also characterized this triple-headed monster as a cousin of Cerberus, the attendant of the god at the great temple of Serapis at Alexandria. Wind makes this additional connection by explaining that Plutarch, whom he feels Gaffurio could have been familiar with, determined that the deity at this temple was a sun god, and therefore associated the Serapis monster with Apollo. Whichever interpretation of the serpent is preferred, at the top center of the image Apollo rests his feet on the curve of its tail, which when portrayed as turning back on itself, as it is here, represents eternity or perfection. Returning to the upper part of the image, to the left of Apollo there are three graces: Euphrosyne, mirth; Thalia, abundance; and Aglaia, splendor. Joseph Campbell relates these figures not only as the three graces, but also as different aspects of the biblical Eve. The central figure, Grace, Thalia, would represent Eve in her state of purity. Mirth, to the left of her and turned away from the god, indicates Eve's rebellious nature, whereas splendor, gazing at the god figure, represents to him Eve as the Virgin Mother Mary. The female head at the very bottom of the illustration, also labeled Thalia here, refers to the first of the 9 muses, and in Campbell's biblical symbolism, under the power of the serpent, also symbolizes Eve in exile. To the right of Apollo is a vase filled with flowers, which during the Renaissance symbolized the virtues of the soul. This vase contains 6 flowers, and when combined with the 3 graces add up to 9, the number of muses. In a sublime allusion to Pythagorean theory, the Triad of Graces corresponds to the 3 tones and their representative muses that create the octave and the perfect fourth that separates them, with the remaining 6 muses identified as the flowers in the vase. Additionally, the placement of Apollo between the muses and the flowers harkens back to Botticelli's Primavera, which placed Venus between the Graces and Flora to symbolize her spiritual and sensuous powers. Wind also suggests that an even stronger relationship between the music of the spheres and the Primavera, in the possibility that the painting was meant to have a musical interpretation, with the 8 characters in the painting representing an octave in the key of Venus. If this was then transposed into the key of Apollo, then the muse Urania would be the highest note of the octave and Clio the lowest. Gaffurio compared Clio to Proserpina in breaking the silence of the earth, which in his image was represented by the silent muse in the underworld, Thalia. As Thalia, the first muse, she is the inspiration for bucolic poetry and comedy, even when, as identified in this illustration, she is silent and in the underworld. The remaining 8 muses are each associated with a particular art, a particular pitch in the Western A minor scale, a Greek musical mode, a metal, and a god, as well as a celestial body, with its related musical frequency caused by the motion of its revolution. Moving up from the bottom, the second muse, Clio, the muse of history, presides over the moon and controls the tides of time. Her note is proslambanominos, or A, and matches the Pythagorean mode. Her metal is silver. Following Clio, Calliope, the muse of heroic poetry, corresponds to Mercury, the guide to souls beyond the temporal sphere. Her note is hypate, hypaton, or B, and matches the Hypophrygian mode. Her metal is quicksilver. Terpsichore, the muse of dance and choral song, corresponds to Venus and Cupid. Her note is Parhypate, hypaton, or C, and matches the Hypolydian mode. Her metal is copper. Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, corresponds to the sun. Her note is Lycanos hypaton, or D, which matches the Dorian mode. Her metal is gold. Erato, the muse of lyric and erotic poetry, which corresponds to Mars, the god of war. Her note is hypate meson, or E, which matches the Phrygian mode. Her metal is iron. Euterpe, the muse of flute music, corresponds to Jupiter. Her note is parhypate meson, or F, which matches the Lydian mode. Her metal is tin. Polyhymnia, the muse of sacred song, corresponds to Saturn. Her note is lycanos meson, or G, which matches the mixer Lydian mode. Her metal is lead. Finally, Urania, the muse of astrology, corresponds to the stars. Her note is Mies, the A, an octave above Clio, which matches the hypo-mixolydian mode. Not one of the 7 classical Greek modes, but a supernumerary mode from Ptolemy that was added by Gafurio, so that fixed stars would not be without music. Gafurio's concept of the ladder of planets was known as far back as the time of the Stoics and was developed in Cicero's Dream of Scipio Africanus the Younger, which he used to conclude the argument of his Republic. Africanus the Younger was said to have lived circa 185 to 129 BC, and as the story goes, in his dream he saw the vision of his dead grandfather, Africanus the Elder, who many years earlier had invaded Africa and defeated Hannibal. The vision urged him to think beyond the earth, to the marvels of a universe of 9 celestial spheres. The vision of Africanus the Elder told his grandson that the fixed stars revolved around the 7 spheres: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon, which in turn revolved around the Earth, which remained immovable. Then Africanus the Younger asked the vision of his grandfather what was the agreeable sound that he was hearing. The grandfather's reply is a poetic retelling of Pythagoras' concept of the music of the spheres. That is produced by the onward rush and motion of the spheres themselves, the intervals between them, though unequal, being exactly arranged in a fixed proportion by an agreeable blending of high and low tones. Various harmonies are produced, for such mighty motions cannot be carried on so swiftly in silence, and nature has provided that one extreme shall produce low tones, while the other gives forth high. Therefore this uppermost sphere of heaven, which bears the starts, as it revolves more rapidly, produces a high shrill tone, whereas the lowest revolving sphere, that of the moon, gives forth the lowest tone. For the earthly sphere, the 9th, remains ever motionless and stationary in its position in the center of the universe, but the other 8 spheres, 2 of which move with the same velocity, produce 7 different sounds, a number that is the key of almost everything. Finally, at the top of the image, the cosmic lesson written on the scroll above Apollo reads, Mentis Apolloni vis has movet undique musas. The energy of the Apollonian mind sets these muses everywhere in motion. This would include silent Thalia below, as rests are necessary to melody. 3. Conclusion. While the ability to calculate Pythagorean ratios illustrated in the music of the spheres may have been improved upon with the introduction of irrational numbers, his discovery of the mathematical relationship between tones laid the foundation for much of Western music theory. While the later astronomical discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo, and others, that the sun is in the center of our solar system, may have modified how we calculate the distances between the celestial bodies from one another, this image continues to fascinate modern-day alchemists with the sheer beauty of this sublime illumination of the relationship between the muses, their musical notes and modes, and that of the corresponding heavenly bodies, gods, and metals attributed to them. Works cited: Calvin Bauer, The Transmission of Ancient Music Theory into the Middle Ages; Joseph Campbell, The Masks of God, Creative Mythology; The Masks of God, Occidental Mythology; Jan Herlinger, Medieval Canonics; Jamie James, The Music of the Spheres, Music, Science, and the Natural Order of the Universe; Thomas J. Matheson, Greek Music Theory; Catherine Nolan, Music Theory and Mathematics; Evan Lansing Smith, Alchemy Slides; Edgar Wind, Pagan Mysteries in the Renaissance; and Victor Zucker-Kandel, Sound and Symbol, Music and the External World. Now, I'm going to do a later analysis, but one thing I wanted to talk about was that it's interesting that you not only have the music of the spheres, but you have the other musics. So Pythagoras believed that it could be divided into 3 basic types: musica instrumentalis, the music made by playing instruments; musica humana, the unheard continuous music made by each human organism; especially the resonance between the soul and the body, and musica mundana, music made by the cosmos, which would come to be known as the music of the spheres. So that's interesting. So there's the music we make on our instruments. That might include the music that we make with our voices. And then there's the musica humana, which is the unheard music made by each human, the resonance between soul and body. So the life is like a music. The spirit is like a music between the soul and the body. And then the musica mundana, music made by the cosmos, including the celestial sounds, this hum, which is imperceptible to the ear, but as Kepler later said, could be heard by the soul. Thanks for listening.